I was supposed to be provoked by Morton's excellent paper in the book Thinking Through Things. I agreed with much of it, and the bit I didn't agree with, I understand that Morton doesn't agree with either, but I was highly provoked by the title of the session, which I didn't agree with at all. Skilled practice is all right, it's the bit after that that bothers me. My understanding of skilled practice is that it's a way of knowing come doing, which you can't really separate out the knowing from the doing, but the important thing is that it's a way, and the practitioner follows a path of some kind. And so, in skilled practice, you both do and know as you go. It's a way of the practitioner, in a sense, finds the grain of the world's becoming and bends it to his or her evolving purpose. The trouble with the concept of cognition is that it seems to me that it's still inevitably bound up with a problem-solving scenario. And that is the scenario built into the cognitivist paradigm, which is first find a solution to a problem and then enact it in the world. Although I have a lot of sympathy for the proponents of the extended mind hypothesis, notably Andy Clark and his collaborators, obviously they're moving in the right direction. They're following in the footsteps of people like Bateson and Gibson, whose work I admire and build on myself. I think that they're still working essentially within a cognitivist logic, even if they include artifacts and all other kinds of stuff. They're outside the human being per se. Within the cognitive apparatus, they still think of that as an apparatus which is basically there to solve problems, which you can then enact in the world. They're still pursuing that cognitivist project. So I think that in order to understand skilled practice, the first thing to do is to ditch the notion of cognition. Incidentally, one of the main inspirations in all this in anthropology is the work of 1988, I think, Jean Lave on cognition in practice. And Jean says she really regrets having called the book by this title. The second thing then is this word artifact that crops in. Well, okay, you just said perhaps shouldn't have been artifact, but it should have been non-human. But suppose it still was artifact. The trouble with the notion of artifact is, in my thinking, is that it's bound up with basically a hylomorphic model of making, which goes back to Aristotle. And Aristotle thought of making, so suppose you're producing a sculpture, you have an idea of the form of the sculpture, that's morphe, you have the raw material, bronze, whatever it is, that's hyle, matter. So you start with form, matter, bring them together, and that's your sculpture. In the history of Western thought, that model has become more and more unbalanced, more and more a question of the form being imposed upon the raw material. And most archaeological and anthropological discussions of artifact making right through the 60s, 70s, 80s, more or less took that assumption that that's what happens when artifacts are made. I would want to argue, and if anybody's looked at a couple of artifacts out there on the table, one is a knot and one is a shell, which sort of exemplify this point, that the form is emergent and that we have to think in terms not of form and matter, but in terms of forces and materials. This is a point that was made very forcefully by Paul Klee in his art, in which he always thought of art as being a growth process analogous to the growth of a plant from a seed. That same idea was taken up by Deleuze and Guattari, who also make the same point. It's not force and matter, it's forces and materials. So that we have to understand making in the first place as a process of growth. And if you do that, then it's impossible in practice to make any kind of hard and fast distinction between artifacts and naturally occurring objects. A thing is only an artifact if you look at it from a particular moment. You can think at this point it's complete and answers to some purpose or other. But that's just momentary point in the trajectory of the materials that made this thing up. But then even if you said, okay, let's not worry about artifacts, we'll talk about objects instead, and not worry about that, about the artifact, natural object distinction. As we discovered already yesterday, the notion of the object is itself deeply problematic. And that's not just because of the implied subject-object distinction. We've already heard lots about that. We had endless discussions explaining why we can't adhere to straightforward subject-object distinctions anymore. That's not where the problem is. The problem is that when you talk about a thing as an object, and here I do agree with Heidegger. I mean, Heidegger makes an important distinction between an object and a thing. You don't have to buy everything that Heidegger says, or even understand everything that Heidegger says. I can't understand the half of what Heidegger says, but I do think the distinction is terribly important. And there's one thing that is important. He says the thing about objects is that they are over against us. It's as though they're complete and have turned our back on us. And he's saying if you want to think about things as distinct from objects, we enter into the process of their formation. It's as though the things we're talking about are continually in formation and we join with them in that process. We don't stand over against them. And I think whatever terms we use, I think this distinction is critically important. The thing about things, in my understanding, is that they leak and they maintain their form only thanks to a constant interchange of material materials across what we perceive to be their outer surfaces. Because the point about leakage was one made very beautifully by Andy Clark in his Being There when he was talking about the mind. And he says that the whole point about the mind is that it keeps leaking. He ought to have said it's the body that leaks and the mind leaks out. But the mind is always leaking out, he says, and mingling unashamedly with the world around. But this leak isn't just a property of minds, it's a property, I think, of things in general. So we have to understand a thing as a sort of gathering together, and this would be Heidegger's view again, gathering together of the threads of life. That is, the prototype image for a thing would be a knot. And now knots are critical to Morton's paper on the shamanic cloak. And the thing about a knot is that it's not a bounded entity, but it's a thing that is made up of strands which then trail off in all sorts of other directions where they might get bound up with other strands in other knots. So you begin to have a picture of the world, and it's made up of all these strands, which I think of materials in motion, all these strands getting knotted up here, going off in different directions there, getting knotted up with other strands here, and it's that kind of picture. You think, well, how is it that a knot retains some degree of permanence? What is it, as Karen Barber asked in a beautiful paper she did for Creativity and Cultural Improvisation Conference a few years back, she said, what is it that makes things stick? Well, if you think about a knot, what is it that holds it together? It's actually the tension. When you tighten a knot, you pull the strands in different directions, and in the middle of it all, where these strands are stitched up, in the very tension and the friction that results from that, you get a degree of stability, a degree of duration. So you make things stick by pulling the threads tight. And I thought actually that Morton's account in the book, Thinking Through Things, of the shamanic cloak, which is all knots, exemplifies this perfectly. It exemplifies the idea that the person, him or herself, is a knot. Whenever you have a nasty fever, don't you sometimes get this feeling in your head that you're a knot? I do. And you really, so it actually makes perfectly good sense. If you're interested in sickness and healing of sickness, you experience sickness often in that very vivid way. And I just put in a note here that all of this is related in a sense to the issue of animism that came up before. There's a tendency when modern cultural theorists say that we've got the animistic turn here. They're always looking for turns. They've got an animistic turn, and they suddenly think we're putting life or agency or something or other into objects so they can stare back in Elkins's terms. And they've got it wrong, because it's not about putting life inside things. Life is the process by which materials are continually flowing across surfaces in order to maintain life. I mean, human beings have to breathe. Oxygen goes in and carbon dioxide goes out. All sorts of stuff goes in and stuff goes out. There would be no life if it wasn't for that. There would be no life if it wasn't for the process of photosynthesis. And photosynthesis involves an interchange between air and stuff in the ground that then fuels plant growth. I think quite interesting nowadays in the sort of rhetoric that surrounds us, that whenever anybody wants to talk about life, they never mention photosynthesis, so we all knew about that. They mention genes. There's no life in the genes themselves, and there would be no life at all if it wasn't for photosynthesis, which is going across the surfaces of the material exchanges across the surface of things. So then we say, if that's what a thing is like, that's what people are like too. People are things in that sense. So not only is the mind leaky, the organism leaks too, and if they didn't, they would be dead. This came up yesterday when we were talking about whether objects have agencies. We found that the problem is not just in the notion of objects, but in the notion of have, as though agency were in a project. It's just as wrong to say as a default assumption that people have agency. Every person or organism is a hive of activity, and if you want an analogy, I would say it's with a compost heap. You take the lid off your compost heap and look at all the worms and stuff that's going underneath. That's a really good image for a human being. Getting back to skilled practice, it doesn't bounce back and forth between people and things, let alone between humans and artifacts. Skilled practice goes along, it wends on its way and always overtakes its destination. So wherever you are, there's somewhere further you can go. And Deleuze and Guattari wrote about such action as the in-between. For example, when I play the cello, there's an interaction between me and the cello, but that's not where the music is. The music is coming off from the point where bow meets the instrument and then moving on. So we think of lives as lived along pathways in that kind, and the relation between them is a contrapuntal relationship, lives in counterpoint. And that's why I'm against the idea of the abduction of agency that people go on about since Alfred Gell, because creative practice is about moving forward, not about connecting up in reverse a series of points already traversed. So to go back to the point I started with, of skilled practice as a movement along a way of life, improvising a pathway through the world, where what's important is to keep on going rather than to reach a final destination, where everything that matters happens along the way. So relationship between skilled practitioners and the materials they work with, I would say, is one of togethering, and that's a term I got from Thorsten Heggestrand, who loved to imagine every person, thing, object as a trajectory, moving along and binding up with other trajectories, and that was back in the mid-1970s.